Okay, welcome back from the break, everybody. I hope you're all well caffeinated, had some interesting conversations. Our next speaker is Dr. Ansgar Rougemont. He is a psychologist, psychiatrist, and psychotherapist with many years of experience working with psychedelic therapy in Switzerland. He's also the author of Das Zeitalter der Vampire, which is for sale in the lobby. And he's an expert on trauma and trauma-related suffering, which forms the core of his talk today. Please welcome Dr. Ansgar Rougemont.
We have the slide. Thank you so much. Thank you, Abigail, for the introduction. Thank you, Paulina and Federico, for organizing this wonderful conference and all the stuff here for this very cordial atmosphere in which we can all share our ideas. So this is a conference I'm talking about, as you see, neuroscience mechanisms, but also about transpersonal evidence. So transpersonal evidence is something that everybody here in this room can understand and will find it evident, yeah? And this is, I think, much related to therapy, because when I accompany patients in their process, with or without psychedelics, I get in contact with this evidence and I have to check with my own feeling and experience, is this true? Can I go with it? What is the message behind? And my journey as a scientist and as a therapist was to go on in exploring all this evidence I become as a human being myself, but also I'm getting from my patients. So to start, still a miracle? Wow. So theory of science, just for the introduction. So why are we all here on this conference? I think everybody here in this room came here because it's about knowledge. It's about enlarging and deepen and sharing knowledge. That's why we are all here. And this is so the epistemic quest of everybody here. And it's about not always accumulating knowledge, but also to deal with how we deal with doubt, how we deal with new evidence, and what is about conviction, and what is sometimes beliefs, and how do we put this all together to come to an understanding of the world. That's why we're all here. And the predominant paradigm of investigating and deepening knowledge of our time is empiricism. It's the science of experience. And this is what we do mostly in research. 90% of research is done and published in empirical science. And as you know, we had lots of examples today. It's about collecting of data according to a method that must be strict. And then we get data, and with the data we can do analysis, interpretation. We can verify assumptions about the world. What is this and this problem? This is the empirical paradigm. And I think it's very important that we have and that we are properly working with that. I agree on that. But I think we had the talk about Ben Sasser about the crisis of psychiatry, mental health crisis. We are not getting enough of understanding with only that method. That's why, and this is the basic of this talk today, I'm presenting you another scientific method, which is phenomenology. And this is the science of appearances. It's devoted to the descriptions of forms. It's about the question that asks phenomenology is how it is to experience this or that in a given context. And the gaining the knowledge, the final conclusion about what is evident is the observation by intuition of the object. And we call this also the Gestalt, or in German the word is the Wesensschau. So we observe with intuition because we are the only observing things in the world, our mind, and we get to a conclusion. And this is how phenomenology works, and I'm of the opinion that this is an important contribution to science. So our culture, our civilization is pretty much based on this man, on the paradigm created and developed by this René Descartes. He's the father of the body-mind dualism. We had to talk yesterday from Peter about that. And just to remind, for René Descartes, animals were just machines. So, and we had also the talk this talk today about nature is basically a dead thing, and it's working like a machine. And the idea, if we as a human being, we have a superior mind, an intellect, we can understand that, and then we can create a theory about how the work is running like a clockwork. And the interesting thing, if something is broken in this machine, we can replace it because we are so skilled for technology. And then, in my opinion, we can go into direction of immortality, no? Because we have a perfect control and understanding and also manipulation of the materia. And this brings up now to go to planet Mars, because we have a problem with planet A. It's not working properly, so that's the problem. It's quite messed up. And though we buy machines, and we go to planet B. And this is a paradigm that is very deeply rooted in our civilization. And I was very lucky as a scientist to meet that man here. Jacques Panksepp, was so lucky to meet him twice. And I was really puzzled by the way he made his studies and the way he was drawing assumptions from research he did on animals. He was an animal researcher. And by studying animals, he came to conclusions, assumptions about what is a human mind. No? And so he's kind of the founder of what we call the affective neuroscience. It's really important that he was really studying not only like animal behave, but how might they feel? How might they be at that very moment when something is happening? So I am of the opinion that Jacques Panksepp was kind of a phenomenological scientist for translational neuroscience. And I said phenomenology is focusing on the evidence of the present moment, because that's the only thing we can observe when we want to observe a state, a given state at a given moment. And so his claim was, we know that we are because we feel. Because now we have machines that think even better than us, and maybe they have consciousness as well. But for us as human beings, the only thing we know that we feel something and we are alive. This is the evidence. So this is a model of Jacques Panksepp to explain animal life form, how people are wired, how are animals wired. And he said there's the panic system and there's the seeking system. This is the seeking system is activated when we go towards something that we like, that is important for our survival, eating, procreation, having sex, and bond with peers or other beings around us. This makes us feel good. And if we lose that, if we starve of hunger, if we are injured, if we are thinking we might die, or if we lose children dies, or we lose contact with peers, someone dies, or we feel excluded, then we feel in panic. It's a deep panical state. And human life and animal life form in general is organized this way. It's a very simple algorithm. And the algorithm is creating emotion. And just to give the anatomical correlates of these systems, some of you might know already, the seeking system is a dopamine system of the brain. It has a center in the VTA, ventral tegmental area, and it goes in many other parts of the brain, and it gives the drive to do things. And it's also known as a reward system. Many of you know already. The panic and grief system is much less known, but it's an area that is very deep in the brain stem, the middle brain. It's around the fourth ventricle here, this area here. Very deep, very ancient. We find it in all kind of low developed animals. They have that already. And it's called the periaqueductal gray. And it's also important to know that the main neurotransmitter of this area is opiates. And if we understand that panic is generated very deeply in the brain when we feel threatened for survival, and this is regulated by opiates, then we might also understand why we have so much opiate addiction in the world. Because people are panicked in that deep area of the brain. Something is going on there. So, this is a catastrophic situation that happened at the shores of Lake Geneva last summer. I happened to be there, and there was an individual that was highly distressed here because it was separated from the family, from the mother. And the mother was not far away, but the mother had 2 other ducklings. And the little duckling, he was separated and in panic, and it was really screaming frantically, panic, deep panic. And what was interesting, that there were about 100 people of another species, 100 individuals of a so-called evolved species that were sitting around in that area, and they were all alerted. They were all also in difficult emotion. Something was going on there with the duckling. And this, this agitation was so intense that all of a sudden 2 people jumped into the water and they were pushing the duckling to go back to the mother. So that was a very interesting situation, because we can see that there's trans-species evidence that there's a certain problem, and people that never read a scientific article about separation distress, they knew what to do and they did the right thing. So I think it's important to remind that we all have this algorithm, that we know that connection and bonding is so important. And we know that even for low evolved species like birds, this state is highly stressful, but we can do something about it. So this is what happened. The ducklings came together, and within seconds, this alert state, this distress state, was calmed down. The simple presence of the mother and the other ducklings was sufficient to totally calm down the duckling that was in panic a couple of minutes before. So this is, I would say, translational evidence from if we look at animals and if we look at ourselves as well. So Panksepp did most of his research on this, called separation distress, how stressful it is, how horrible it is to feel abandoned in important relationships. And I would say separation distress is a central paradigm to understand the evidence of psychic pain. And this is something maybe we can observe not only in the specific situation of the separation of a child and the mother, but in many, many other dynamics in our society. And what Panksepp also found out, this is his study, that in order to soothe down that panic of a separation distressed individual, the most important action to undertake is to take it in the arm, is physical contact. So important. Nothing else works that well like physical soothing down a distressed person. And another finding of Panksepp was that if you are not able to provide touch, because maybe the mother's dead or nobody is able to give touch, then we can substitute this by opiates. And again, this explains maybe why we have so many addiction problems in our society. Because people feel disconnected, and to soothe the pain, they just take the substance that works best, opiates. Good. So, and this is one of the most important publications of Jacques Panksepp in the Science Journal, where he showed, oh, sorry, I need to put this back. He said the separation distress circuit neuroanatomically that we see in a guinea pig is pretty much the same as the activation of the neuro areas of the human brain in people that are deeply depressed. So in this view, and this is a phenomenological view of the experience of depression, it's a painful state, and we can have an understanding of this state as, maybe it's a state that corresponds to separation distress, and we can understand it as loss of connection. So this, for me, it's a strong evidence, translational, transpersonal, that if we lose connection, we feel threatened. This is very painful. This can manifest as depression, and we can do something about it with either touch and support, or maybe with opiates. This conference is not about opiates, but I think it would be good to research much more clinically about these substances. So I present this to you because it's an example that what I call phenomenology or the Wesensschau, that we try to catch the gestalt of a problem like depression, what is that? And we take evidence from different methods, and all the evidence are telling us something, that's true, but we have to understand the whole thing. And I think this is what's happening when we accompany patients in their healing process, in their suffering, that we get glimpse of evidence what's from the experience, and we put the pieces together and we make sense of it. It's giving sense to an experience. And this is what I wish, it's my deep wish for psychedelic science, that we're able to integrate phenomenology also in our scientific approach. Yeah. And this is another example also from this observation of what is going on with the patients. So in psychiatry at the moment, we have, when we talk about trauma, we say trauma is explained by the A criteria. That means that there's a horrible thing that happened, catastrophe, someone died, and this explains why the people are having problems. This is the A criteria definition of trauma. But there are also other definitions or proposals, mainly based on Pierre Janet, the French psychotraumatologist, and he defined trauma as an expression of unsuccessful integration. In this view, that means a trauma sequelae condition develops when an event cannot be successfully integrated into the person's view of self, the world, and the future. And this is then an overload of the organism's integration capacity. This is how we can understand trauma and the trauma-related disorder. And I would like to remind how a trauma disorder develops. There's first, indeed, a catastrophic event, which is causing an acute stress reaction. Well, in everybody here, if you are having a heavy car accident or losing someone's dying in front of you, you will be highly stressed, everybody here in this room. And then what happens? So this is a normal reaction toward a not normal situation. This is physiological normal, everybody. And then what we see is normally 85% of people, they go back to normal and they don't have any problem in the long run. They full remission. But not all. Some of them, they will stay in that state of alert, of the acute stress reaction for a long time, sometimes for a whole life, because the system is not normalizing. So I explain to my patients, PTSD, what you have, what brings you here is basically, it's a deficit of the normalization of the acute stress reaction. And if we have that understanding, we can have a look what we need to do to normalize the situation, this reactivity. And this is what I call then treatment. And then this brings up to the question, what should we do in order to allow people to not to go into this difficult state, but rather to heal, to integrate successfully an experience. And just to explain what we know about the factors that are important. So we have on the one side the stressful event, and on the other side, and this is often not seen in our description, they have a lack of integration in the peri and post-traumatic phase. So there are two factors that are necessary to make acute stress reaction develop into a trauma sequelae condition, how I call it. Two factors. The first, we already know it, we see it, we talk about it all the time, this and this happened. But then the second thing is a really interesting thing. What did the environment after the trauma happened? How was the person taken care of? This is the real decisive question. Thus, this is what I call the second wave. I also compare this a little bit. Trauma is the thing that is breaking the arm, and the reaction to the trauma is making that the broken arm is splintered or not. And if the broken arm is not splintered, then it will stay broken for the rest of the life. These are evidence I learned from my patients when I accompany them. So the most important thing in order to prevent trauma-related disorders in the long run is to make sure that these people are safe now. That's already very important. And they are safe when the trauma just occurred. We could do much more in the emergency departments if we knew and we would better put these things in practice. The first thing is security, safety. You are on a safe place now. That's what we do also in somatic trauma. But we also have to take care of there can be another accident happening to the same person shortly after. And there can also be accidents that can happen to the people trying to help. I think we also have to address maybe the problem of vicarious traumatization of therapists if we do trauma work, and psychedelic work as well. And what we all know, unfortunately, we know that too often the victim of trauma is sent back into a traumatizing, violent situation. And how can we heal someone? And this is a real question was addressed here before. What sense does it make to heal people when we have to send them back in mistreating conditions? Do we have also to take care of the condition and to address this problem as well as the collective problem? So, a lack of integration in the peri- and post-traumatic period typically develops within a dynamic of neglect. The victim is not protected from further abuse. He or she is assumed to be exaggerating or making up a story. The environment pretends that the mistreatment is normal or not receivable because it's too difficult for the system to deal with it. Just leave it like this and we can go on. This happens very often. And so, in final, the fact of the abuse is negated. And the victim has to deal with that. The victim gets a message from the system, what's your problem? And someone who has to face this has only the solution to put this evidence of mistreatment and trauma in the drawer of dissociation. We put it somewhere far away because we cannot live it officially anymore. We have to find a solution to put it somewhere and pretend to live on your life. And this is the metaphor of a haunted life. I like a lot this idea of we're living in a home and somewhere hidden in the basement there's a phantom that is intruding on us ever and ever again. And we have to remind, if we accompany these persons, that as part of this process, which is serving survival, the victim has to adapt to the explanation of the perpetrator and also to the social group. The perpetrator will say, this is normal, what happened to you. The family will say, this is normal, what happened to you. How can you complain? So the victim has to adapt to this view on reality. And so we come from the statement of the perpetrator who says, you are so bad, dirty, and unlovable, and therefore I must treat you this way. This becomes integrated, identified with, and the victim will think, I am bad, I'm dirty, and I'm unlovable. Because with this view on the reality, it can survive mistreatment that is still ongoing. It's very important that we are aware of these mechanisms, because in psychedelic therapy and trauma therapy, this evidence is popping up ever and ever again, very clearly. So by this mechanism of adaptation to survive, the victim enters what we call the prison of guilt and shame. And this is chronically manifest as a clinical deep depression in many cases. And what is interesting that the evidence of the mistreatment, if it was happening very early in life or even during youth and adolescence, is not accessible because it's hidden in dissociative amnesia. And this process of identifying with the logic of the neglecting environment and of the logic, the mindset of the perpetrator who is mistreating the individual that cannot fight back is called traumatic attachment. The person will find it normal to be mistreated because this is the way it is, and it will also seek and search for a relationship in which she or he will be mistreated in real later in life. This is traumatic attachment. Another term for that is called Stockholm syndrome. We are sympathizing with the perpetrator because this is a way of surviving the situation. And this is very frequent in therapy, and we have to deal with it. And just a study about the importance of traumatic dissociative amnesia. This is a study where women were interviewed, on which they were files in courts and police department that were documenting sexual abuse in these women as children, and they were contacted by the researcher 17, 20 years after this, and 38% of the women did not remember having mistreated sexually. They couldn't remember it because this is hidden in dissociative amnesia. So this is something we have to know when we treat people with psychedelics, because these things will pop up. And I think it's a good thing that we have these tools, but we must prepare, and I think it needs very solid psychotraumatologic skills to accompany these states with psychedelics. And if you have this understanding of psychic pain and suffering from the phenomenological side, I think we come also to a conclusion that maybe we have much more trauma-related disorders in our health mental system than we think. And the candidates in our current situations: borderline personality disorder, somatoform disorders, fibromyalgia, pain disorder, and of course, therapy-resistant depression, chronic fatigue syndrome, I would also say burnout. And of course, as we heard from Ben Sessa, addiction. All these are probably trauma-related conditions that we have very widespread in our population. And of course, psychotraumatologists are often accused of using the term trauma in an inflationary way. But I think it's, if we see to the evidence that we receive from these patients about their experience here and now, I think it's still justified to consider these conditions post-traumatic conditions. And I think these are all good indications for psychedelic treatment, because it's about working on the trauma identification that is related to these disorders. So now I come more to specific aspects of psychedelics in treating these problems, this identification with mistreatment. I'm not talking about the hardware. You probably have heard about it. I will talk more of the software problems and how to be in relation to oneself and to the world, how to treat information. I will talk about this and about the place of psychedelics. So in my opinion, one of the biggest challenges for treating these patients is to overcome the phobic avoidance of the traumatic memory. As we've seen, the dissociative memory is not accessible because it's too painful. The person has put it away in a drawer. And I think MDMA is a great substance to do exactly this. I will tell a little bit more about this. Another problem I see is the deficit of contextualization. The people are not present in the here and now. They are still in the presence of the abuse, of the mistreatment. The mistreatment is not over yet. And we can normalize this, in my opinion, also with psychedelics. And the biggest problem, however, is the traumatic attachment. I explained a little bit before, this identification of mistreatment. And I think this is we can only address this with in a healing therapeutical relationship. And it's all about overcoming the identification with the mindset of the perpetrator. This is therapy, this is healing, to get free of this burden. So this is, in my opinion, this is a really sensational study, because it shows what is the neural correlate of dissociative amnesia. We had this study where women could not remember, and many of our patients cannot properly remember what really happened to them. And we always think, well, this is just made up, this is just a fantasy, this is just an accusation, there's no proof, there's no memory, so why should we care about it? No? And now we know that indeed this person cannot remember, because whenever they try to go in this direction, the amygdala lights up and says, stop, don't go here, this is not possible. Well, that's what we see in treatment. People cannot go there, and this is what we see in brain scans here. Amygdala says, stop, don't go there. That's why they can't remember. And then we give MDMA to these people, and then we see on the blue, on the right side, the exact opposite. It shuts down. The amygdala shuts down, and the hippocampus shuts down, and we can go calmly have a look at these things. And this is like you look at the broken arm and you see, oh, it's no longer broken, it already healed in a way. And I realize all the panic has no reason anymore, and I go over it. This is MDMA. I think it's very precious to do and to use it in trauma therapy. Okay, and then there's another mechanism that it's a little bit difficult to explain, but I think it's crucial, and it's related to implicit learning. It's related to Pavlovian operant conditioning, and this is what we observe in animals as well as in human beings. And you might say, why should we bother about these things? We are talking about mystical experience, we are talking about human mind and consciousness, and why should we bother about these very basic things? I think it's crucial to understand the dysregulation in these mechanisms in disorders that are trauma-related and are addictive, because this is exactly happening in these networks of the brain. That's why I think it's important to explain. So we have the paradigm of classical conditioning. You can have all kinds of setups, and you have a context office room where the light goes on and the subject gets an electrical shock on the head. This is unpleasant, it's painful, and the implicit memory will store this information. This is a dangerous context here. Something bad will happen. And then you can go into another context, let's say bibliothèque, and there's also light going on and nothing happens. So you learn here, I'm safe. The light goes on, nothing happens, I'm safe. So this is called extinction training. The person learns, here I'm safe, there's no reason to be in fear. This is conditioning, learning to have fear, and extinction, unlearning to have fear. And then people come back the next day and they're tested against in the safe context, context B, and the light goes on and nothing happens, and the reaction is measured, are they fearful or not? And so you have an idea what kind of memory trace is there and activated. And this is what we get. We get a discriminative response of the implicit memory and working memory towards this kind of stimuli. First, people learn in the dangerous context to have fear. Then they learn in the safe context not to have fear anymore. You see the skin conductance goes down, and that means there's no more fear, and this is a learned reaction. What is then important, the next day they come back and they're exposed to the context in which they were shocked or not shocked, and we measure the reactivity, and we see, oh, people remember correctly in this context here, bibliothèque, I'm safe. So I'm not showing any fear response. But if they go into the dangerous context, they show again a fear response. And this is correct, because they remember in this context I was shocked. So the implicit memory is making a discrimination between different contexts and stimuli in order to help us to react in the most efficient way, to help us survive. The problem is with trauma patients and addictive patients, this is completely messed up, as I will show you. So we know now extinction recall is impaired in PTSD patients. It means PTSD patients, when they go into extinction learning, they learn like everybody else. They learn in this context, there's no shock, I have no reason to be in fear. The fear reaction goes down, and there's no significant difference between the PTSD group and the control group. But if they go back and the day after, one night of sleep, and they're tested again in this context in which they have learned to be shocked or not to be shocked, what we see that the PTSD patients, they have fear again. They express fear again. Although the control that do not have PTSD, they correctly activate the no fear memory, extinction memory. So this is a big difference in the reactivity of implicit information between these groups. And this is one of the reasons why these patients are always in fear. So I did a study when I was in Boston, and we were able to show that, that there are two areas, and this is what Ben Sessa told before, the prefrontal cortex is dysregulated, and we know a little bit more about this. There's one area called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex that is too active, overactive, and there's another part, the VMPFC, that is not active enough. And this dysregulation is responsible for not being able to treat correctly the information. And this, on the phenomenological level, translates for these patients as being never safe. I feel never safe, and this explains symptoms like hypervigilance, anxiety, fear. This is always there. They never feel safe. And I would also stress this is not only a theoretical problem, or we can really say we live in a culture where people still live in the contextualization deficit because they really believe that World War II is not over yet, or the Cold War is not over yet. They really feel threatened by countries and think there are Nazi armies attacking them. They really believe that. And because they are so much afraid, and this is in their perception real, they act exactly in the way to provoke that threat. So the problem with contextualization deficit is the person that has not integrated the fact that it's living in the context of the past will act in a manner that will create the threat in real now. That's why it's so important to get awareness of it. So, and if we do meta-analysis of studies, we will find what I think is very interesting as an addiction specialist. The same areas are dysregulated not only in fear-related, PTSD-related, trauma-related disorders, but the same areas are also dysregulated in addiction. So addiction and PTSD in a certain way is kind of the same when it comes to the prefrontal cortex. And we know that these areas, as Ben Sessa said, are responsible for controlling the nucleus accumbens for addiction and approach, and the amygdala for fear response. And if we have a problem here, we have a major problem here down. And then we can understand that these people that have this dysregulation that is acquired in life, they have a big problem with dealing with frustration, with difficult emotion, with pain, with rejection in the social context. And all the life of these people is deeply biased in the daily life by this prefrontal dysregulation. And now we come to psychedelics, and because I tested the areas of interest, of course we're tested in imaging studies as region of interest. So you see here imaging studies where you have a seat here in the VMPFC here, or here another study with MDMA, the VMPFC is investigated, and you see also the VMPFC is in this scan part of the default mode network. And this activation, typically people tell themselves a story about themselves as a victim, or something is bad and the life is like this. This is a default mode network, the narrative about the ego all the time, from morning to evening. And if we gave to these people psychedelics here, psilocybin, then we see the whole system shuts down. It's completely different from one moment to the other. And also the same with MDMA, we see the connectivity is deeply altered when we give the substances. And the way we treat contextualized information is completely different. And we see the same things concerning the DACC here with ayahuasca. The connectivity between this center and other centers of the brain is deeply altered when we give them these substances. And in my reading, this allows to have a new look of the context of here and now. So I try to explain to you what is a contextualization deficit and what is neurobiologically recontextualization. From the phenomenological point of view, recontextualization is a two-sided sword. If you go from now, from a normal state in a deep state of connecting to the context of now, two things can happen. One thing is that you realize the war is over, there's no reason to be in fear, I am in a safe place, and I can enjoy life. This can be a blissful experience that you connect with the context of here and now, and you see, wow, it's good to be here and be in peace and enjoy all these nice things. This is a blissful experience, but you can also go into contextualization, and you go into the session and think, oh, I'm quite fine, I do a little bit of exploration, and I'm quite happy about the person I am. And all of a sudden, you take a psychedelic, or you meditate maybe, or do holotropic breathwork, and you may all of a sudden realize the party's over. The narrative I was talking to myself about who I am is not right anymore. There's a problem. Maybe my relationship is not good. My workplace engagement is a catastrophe. All the things I was telling myself about my family are not true. And this is then awakening up of saying, wow, this is the context of here now is showing me very difficult aspects of life. And this is a two-sided sort of recontextualization. And this is what some people call, in my opinion, this is explaining the horror trip, a bad trip. That realize that something else is happening within me, and this is difficult to deal with it. So on the last slide, to go a little bit deeper in traumatic attachment, traumatic attachment, as explained, is this identification with the logic of the perpetrator. It's a central life problem of PTSD, of complex traumatized person, that this deep identification, the view on oneself, on the world, and on relationship in general. So as I said, we have typically that statement, this belief, I am bad, dirty, unlovable. I hear that from so many people, they say that deeply in them. And then other beliefs on the world emerge, like very typical, a meaningful relationship is one in which there's a lot of turmoil. I hear that so often. When there's conflicts, this is a significant relationship, and when there are no conflicts, this is an insignificant relationship, it's not worth it, and they go away. Other beliefs are, it is normal that I'm not respected or even treated badly. Or another belief is, I need to become a better person. Why? Why do so many people believe they should become a better person? So what is the basic assumption about themselves? Another phrase, I have gone through hardships, therefore I expect hardships from others. This is how we treat each other in our society. We are very harsh to each other. And we think this is normal. And then the statement, it is normal that so many people suffer around me. The whole world is burning, and yeah, it's normal. We can't do anything about it. We identify with this, with the violence around us. And finally, what I hear about especially sexual abuse is the evidence of the perpetrator, I had a shitty life, therefore you should not have a better one. So the identification of this mistreatment can lead the victim also to become a perpetrator. And you will hear that from lots of your victims of abuse, that they will understand that their parents, they abused them, were also deeply traumatized. And everything is explained by that. So if we really go into this understanding of the chain of identification from the victim to the perpetrator, we understand, in my opinion, transgenerational trauma on a very basic level. We understand it. How is this possible? So, and to end up, I have a last slide on a very important animal model of mental health problem. This is the animal model of learned helplessness. You put an animal into a cage and you put electrical shocks in the cages, and normally when the animal has the possibility to jump out into a safe place, the animal will do that because it's evident. It will jump out on the safe side here, no shock. But if you want to traumatize this animal and you want to create a depressed animal, what do? You put also electrical shock here all the time. So the animal, whatever it does, if it jumps or not, it will always get a shock and get traumatized at any reaction. So, and this is what we do in science to investigate trauma and depression. This is a model of depression, learned helplessness. So, and this is, of course, also working for human beings. If we always get punched, regardless what we do and how we try to protect us, we will get into deep resignation and depression. So what do you have to do to help such an animal? Do you think there's a drug that can tell this animal how to get protection, how to get out of this mess? That any drug can do that? The answer is no, of course. So what you need to do with such a traumatized animal, you have to take it physically and to lift it up and to bring it in a safe place, because the animal has unlearned to do it for himself. You as a human being, you as a therapist can do that, because you have an understanding of the situation. So this is the first step of healing. We have to show people how to take care and to bring them in a safe place and to take care of them. And this is what I think is therapy is about, that we understand there's someone, it can be a human being, it can be an animal in distress, and we have an idea, we have an evidence, transpersonal evidence, translational evidence, what we can do about it, and we do it. And then we give the chance to this individual to get rest, to feel protected and safe, restore the energies, and walk on with the life. So in my opinion, this is the healing of deep trauma is also a spiritual act. In a therapeutic context, it is a task of the therapist to create a space in which love can manifest. And love in that understanding is, in the spiritual sense, compassion, trust, and acceptance. And this is, I think this is the only and most important healing power that people experience this in one way or the other, and they can activate their own resources and activate their inner healer. Because all the individual animals or human beings, we have that capacity to go on and go through stressful things and resource ourselves and go into healing. And this is why I think we also should talk about deep things. What is it happening with really healing of deep trauma? What is the healing ingredient? I think we can call it love, we can call it compassion, we call it in many ways, but it's important that we try to get an understanding. And I think psychedelic therapies bring us there to question this. And it's also for me to remind psychedelics means to reveal the soul. So we have to stay there and ask ourselves, well, what do we see when we work with psychedelics? Is this what is becoming manifest? And I'm not saying that the therapist is doing something very special. I think the task of the therapist is to create a space in which these things can manifest. So this is what I wanted to talk and to show you, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ansgar. That was lovely. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Thank you very much for this topic. I wonder how deep can this healing go? We know that, for example, borderline personality disorders are very closely linked to trauma. And I wonder also about other personality disorders. Are there experiences with psychedelic-assisted therapy?
Well, this is the question about what kind of pathologies are the good indications for these kind of therapies. I would say we need to get an understanding of the sense of the disease or disorder of the state of suffering. And if we have a sense and it's related to disconnection and psychic pain, then maybe we can go into these kinds of therapies. But of course, this also questions all idea about how we categorize psychic suffering. We have a very descriptive system at the moment, and we orient on this, but maybe we should move on a more phenomenological understanding of psychic suffering. And then we also get the key, which are maybe the best therapies, or maybe some people really need rather pharmacology, and some people need more of psychotherapy, or something may need more of the mix of this. But I'm advocating that we try to enlarge or to evolve in our categorizing mental disorders in order to get a sense of the phenomenological experience.
Hello. How does EMDR compare to the psychedelic-assisted therapies in treating PTSD in terms of the effects on the brain and the overall effectiveness?
Okay, I like EMDR, and I really use the EMDR tool of understanding, conceptualizing mental suffering a lot. So I really learned a lot of EMDR and still practice it. I describe EMDR like neurophysiologically, for me, it's overcharging. It's a dual task interference on the working memory, which is occupied with processing trauma. You are forcing the person while the person is exposing to trauma, to her process, you are distracting it by another task, and while doing so, you're slowing down, you're breaking down the intensity of the exposure, and you can come in with regulating information. This is my model, my understanding of EMDR, and I think it's very useful. It's a little bit like the MDMA effect of shutting down the amygdala, that it's not going too much in activity. And I think you do this in EMDR by these movements, in my opinion.
Hello. Could you describe us, thank you for your presentation, how long is your process, or if you could describe the process with patients with complex PTSD, dysregulated nervous system, or chronic pain for long, and how do you approach it, or if you could just share some experiences, or how long it takes, or how is it for you? Thank you.
Well, I think you can imagine that this is a long process of therapy, of sessions with or without psychedelics. I normally start with ketamine. I start ketamine experiencing with my patient. Then after a while, I go on with MDMA, and after a while, I then go on with psilocybin. But there are about 2 to 4 sessions a year, not more. And the rest is integration, accompanying, and this can take years. It can take years. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. It was really, really interesting. Going a bit back to the EMDR question, if you happen to know and have knowledge on the subject, would you mind sharing a bit more of the neural correlates of what happens during an EMDR session? Like, what are the pathways, what are the brain centers that are activated, and how does that exactly help in processing and integrating trauma? Okay, so this is an explanation about the working memory. The working memory has a limited capacity of treating information. And if you cannot do double tasking as a human being, you cannot calculate at the same time you write an email. You do one thing and then do the other, even if you do them here and there, but it's not possible for the human brain, for the working memory, to do 2 tasks that need attention simultaneously. So if you ask the patient in EMDR to expose
to a trauma memory, and you simultaneously ask the patient to follow the eyes, and he has to concentrate on that, you will overcharge the working memory, dealing with that, the central executive dealing with all that things at the same time, and this will force the going into contact with the trauma to go down. So the trauma is not activated fully because you are distracting the system. So this is the working memory theory about EMDR, which is, I think, a good explanation. It called the mechanism is called dual task interference.
Thank you.
I also have a question regarding trauma techniques. In your experience, how important are different techniques regarding to the space you provide, the space of, as you gratefully named it, with love also, and if specific techniques, which ones do you use for what?
I think one very important ingredient is the music. Music for me is a divine language. It's only human beings we are able to capture and to go into this experience with music. I think the choice and the good display of music, intense music, is very important. Yeah, and other ingredients is just to really be sure that the person is safe. There are no disturbing noise. It's warm. It's there's no telephone ringing, and there are not people running in and out. It's a beautiful place. There are flowers maybe. So this is the responsibility of the therapist to take care of the space.
My question is regarding the integration sessions, not the substance sessions.
The integration is for me always to have a look the integration is have a look at contextualization deficit. The question is the contextualization deficit still active when you have a look on your life here? Because in the session you may have seen this is over and I'm out of it, but maybe in the material reality there are still relationships or difficulties that are representing a contextualization deficit. The person is in an abusive relationship, the person has feel threatened on the material way. This is something that can be the mirror of a traumatic situation of the past. But it's here now, you have to identify it and you have to address it here. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. Over here. Hi. I have a question concerning the animal component of your presentation. And it precisely concerns what I perceived as a rather shocking irony towards the end. At the beginning, you had the rather touching story about everyone, the human beings on the beach reacting very empathically towards the little duckling. But then at the end of your presentation, you based your final point about how to help people with trauma on a study in which humans traumatized a dog in order to reach conclusions about trauma in human beings, which was a quite shocking irony to me. So,
but that's what we do.
Yeah. So then my question based on that is, you also put forward the points about intergenerational trauma. You explained that people traumatize other people because they've been traumatized. But how does that then map onto why, for generations, humans continually traumatize animals? It's not like animals have traumatized us in that sense. Dogs didn't put us in cages and shock us to learn about why dogs are traumatized. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I think this is what I tried to show with a slide of René Descartes, who believed and he operated himself on living animals because he was considered them to be machines. And I think this is still, and it's also what we heard this morning, our anthropocentric view, all for religious reason, from the book of Genesis. We are superior to animals and we have the right to control them. And we think, because we can think so much, we have the thinking cap, cogito ergo sum, we are special and the animals don't have that, so we have the right to do that. So it's very deeply rooted in our culture. Of course, there's now more and more awareness of this, and I'm very happy about this, but we are still very far away from considering a continuum of consciousness between all forms of animal life form, and that also what I like to would stress out, that we as human beings will be superseded by other forms of intelligence and consciousness in the future, and we have to accept this as well.
Can I follow up super quick? Is that allowed?
Mm.
Well, just it's not quite simple, the explanation of people in the dog example perceiving the dog as a mere automaton, because there were conclusions based on how dogs react to trauma, and that was then applied to humans. So if the dog was perceived as a mere automaton, that move couldn't be made. So it's still a little more bizarre than that. The dog is kind of like a human because it reacts to trauma in the same way, but not entirely. So I think the relation is a little more complex than the Descartes-style relation.
I don't know what to answer more to you, but I can sense in you that you are, reacting to realize in which we treat animals, also in research maybe, and how we gain evidence in science, but also how we treat animals in daily life. And this is something that is becoming evident as a problem in the psychedelic experience. Yeah.
Let's do 2 more questions.
Yeah, I have one. Yes, I'm here. Thanks a lot. You mentioned in your presentation how psychedelics change the way a person perceives reality, and also the flow of information in the brain, if I understood properly, and how that helps the patient to deal with his trauma. My question is, have you ever used dreams, like recalls of dreams? Because it's also obviously an instance where our brain work in different ways. And in your practice, have you used it, and how does it relate to how psychedelics work? And do you see any parallels, and what proves to be more helpful? I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
I think it's always interesting to have a look at dreams and to encourage the person who's reporting the dream to come to an understanding and to find sense. So I accompany my patients to do that, but I have not so far having put a focus on dream telling in relation to psychedelic sessions. Not yet so far.
Yeah. I should like to point that the therapist, sometimes I get overwhelmed by that, what I see, what I hear, I feel, and I try to be open. And can you say some words to how to deal with this the Gegenübertragung? In these difficult cases,
Yeah, of course, Markus. What you mentioned, it's very crucial that we are aware that in the session, in this altered state of being in the age regression, the therapist become also symbolic of the parental figure, and there can be lots of harsh interaction. This can be very challenging for the therapist as well. So I think it's not to underestimate what can come up in such a session. It's really deeply challenging the therapist and can be overcharging as well. I mentioned a little bit the problem of vicarious traumatization of the therapist. That is a general problem for all psychotraumatologists when they treat patients, but it's also, I think, something we should be very careful and aware of it in psychedelic fields. So for instance, I'm not able to do a psychedelic session and work the next day. The next day I cannot work. I take time for myself.
The supervision or intervision is very important, I think.
that's so important to share with colleagues and to realize that this is really hard stuff, and it's not just something that happened 30 years ago. It's something that is manifesting here and now in the relationship here and now between therapist and patient. It's emerging, and the patient brings it up to show, and you have to deal with it. So it's very, very intense, and it's really necessary, important that there's intervision, that there's supervision, and that we are taking good care of us as therapists. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ansgar. I really appreciated your talk.
Thank you.
Let's give him another round of applause.